Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin, and I have a whole lot actually, in this case, to say about how to get the most fabric out of a men's dress shirt. And so we've already done shirt prep. So we bought our shirt, we've got it ready, washed it, taken the buttons off. We've now gotten the bottom and side seams out, and today's video is about the sleeves and cuffs. So in part 3 of our series on how to get the most fabric out of a men's dress shirt, we're going to cover the sleeves and the cuffs. And this is actually a fairly, I don't want to say technical because there's really nothing about me that's technical, but there's a lot of specific, it's so true. But I'm very hands-on, very practical, want to get as much fabric as possible. And so I've kind of worked out this system that works for me for how to get fabric out of the sleeve. And you're really going to be shocked at how much fabric you can get from the sleeve of a men's dress shirt. You may remember in part 1, I talked about going on and getting all the buttons taken off of a shirt. And we have now arrived at one of those places where we're going to be thankful that we've done that. When you get the buttons off, it gives you more options. So it's kind of like a choose your own adventure. Do you remember those books? Choose your own adventure, and you choose so-and-so, and then you have to go to page 27. So this is like choose your own adventure without the adventure. It's not very adventurous unless you really like fabric. And I actually really like fabric. So for me, it really kind of is an adventure. But what we've done is we've gotten those side seams out. So now we have this sleeve, actually 2 sleeves, that are attached by the side and bottom seams. Let's do this. The first thing we're going to do is cut away the cuff. Now, here's the thing about cuffs. The shirt that I happen to be breaking down today is this kind of nice light sage green that I will probably use in 1,000 quilts. But it has cuffs that are meant for cufflinks. So instead of 2 buttonholes, there's 4 and no buttons. However, there were buttons on the actual sleeve. So if there had been a button on the cuff, then by taking that off, if we decide we want to use some of that fabric from the cuff, you can. So the first thing we're going to do in this situation, so I've got my sleeve, I'm going to cut the cuff off really as close to that seam as possible. And this is a time, again, we were talking about in our last video about using big scissors to motor through a long seam. This is not a long seam, but it has a lot of fabric gathered here. So there's a lot of fabric that's been sewn and folded and then sewn again. So you need a pair of scissors that can do that job. So I'm going to cut right along here by the seam and just get that cuff out of the way. Here's the options. This cuff, because it was intended for cufflinks, is actually a pretty decent size piece of fabric. Now, it's not like a fat quarter or a fat eighth. Fat quarter, by the way, is 18 inches by 22 inches of fabric. That's a pretty standard quilting measure. A fat eighth is exactly what you would think, which is half of that. So it's 9 inches by 22 inches, give or take. Sometimes they're a little bit less, sometimes they're a little bit more. It's not a big swath of fabric, but there's some fabric there. So if it were not a cuff-linked cuff, then I would probably toss it, unless it was a fabric that I really liked. Probably now's a good time to talk about the fact that cuffs have interfacing a lot of times in them. You can kind of hear that noise. It's a cardboardy fabric stiffener that is fused into the fabric that gives it that sturdiness like a collar and cuffs. So first thing I'm going to do is in this cuff is I'm going to cut off where the buttonholes are, just kind of in a mostly, that wasn't very straight actually, but just kind of a straight shot. That right there is not really anything usable. So I'm going to throw that away. In the first video, I talked about having a trash can nearby. This is the time. If there ever was a time that you need a trash can nearby, and it needs to be probably on your dominant side so you can do like me and just not even think about it and go like, and there it went. So I don't know why I did that, but anyway. All right, so now you have a choice. If you want to use your seam ripper, we haven't used it yet, seam reaper, or maybe we did. You can use your seam ripper. I really am gonna just start calling it that exclusively. And you can insert your, the little pronged part in here and kind of get it started and pull that seam apart. And the thing about seam rippers is there's all different ways to use them. So a lot of times if you can get it started, you just poke that little prong in there under one of those seams or in between the seam. And then once you have a room to move, you turn this over and that little red ball goes on the inside, and that keeps it from cutting the rest of the fabric. And you can kind of get it started. This cuff does not want to do it that way. So what I have learned in doing just so many shirts is sometimes you have to come at it, you go up and get it started, and then sometimes you have to come from the top down. I don't know why. Certain seams just seem to resist that. And then if you can get a long stretch, I'm really hoping that I do because it's so rewarding. It's like this, and it just is so satisfying. But it looks, alas, it is not going to do that. Those of you that have watched Harry Potter, there's this scene where Dumbledore Harry Potter is trying to get him to try every flavor of beans. And he says that the first time he had it, it was vomit flavored, so he hadn't had them since. And now he's this 600-year-old man. And he says, maybe it's safe to try. And then he gets him to try one and it is earwax flavored. And so he goes, alas, earwax. Oh, I think I got it started. Okay. Nope. Alas, earwax. But you just basically kind of work that seam back and forth with your seam ripper. Oh, it did it a little bit. I wish I could get you to hear that. Well, maybe you don't have the ASMR needs that I do, but that it is just so satisfying. When you use a seam ripper, here's a little tip. This is one of the technical parts. Not really technical, but don't try to wedge your seam ripper, that sharp prong, into the very end where all the fabric meets. Kind of find a place like an inch in where there are not as many folds of fabric, and then a lot of times you can get a good long. So I've done it, finally made it happen. Sometimes you can do what I just did, which is tear just a tiny little bit. So I'm going to move that little piece of fabric there, and you can see that there is the interfacing side that's pretty heavy duty, and then there's this other side that is actually just a nice, decent sized piece of fabric. I'm going to actually save that. Again, the seam ripper, sometimes you just have to do one little pop. You can just feel it. It goes pop. Ooh, it did it. Back and forth until you get it started. Sometimes you have to do like one seam at a time, which is really kind of annoying. But if you really want to get all that fabric that you can out of there, sometimes it must be done. So you can see where that's coming apart. Just a little bit at a time. So sometimes I'll do there's just a seam right there, and I'll just pop through those until I can get it started. Let me see if I can get that red ball situation going. Nope, I'm gonna end up ripping that, I think. Again, in the options time, or in the options topic, sometimes I just go, you know what? I don't wanna spend that time. And I get my big scissors, and I could just go like, romp, and just cut that whole part straight off of there. It makes that noise. Did you not know that? Romp. So I cut that I cut that seam off, and now I have this pretty decent size piece of fabric. This side has the interfacing attached to it, and it's kind of such heavy duty interfacing. It's not worth it to me to try to use that in some way. So I'm gonna trash it. Bloop. And we talked about our scrap bin. I may have actually talked about the scrap bin excessively, but this would be a perfect example of a nice size piece of scrap. So that's gonna go in my scrap bin, which I also have on my dominant side. And then while we're here, I'm just gonna go ahead and cut this piece that's the where the buttonhole is to open up the cuff / sleeve so that you can get your hand in the sleeve. I'm just gonna go ahead and cut that out. I have learned from experience, there's really not anything. I'm sure somebody can do something with that. I am not that somebody. So I'm gonna cut that out, trash, more waste. Now, this is the fun part. On this sleeve, all that we have left is this seam and this seam. So the shoulder and then the underneath the arm. I start at the shoulder, and the way I do this is I kind of push the front part of the shoulder seam and the back shoulder seam together. I kind of work it between my fingertips so I can feel where the bump of the thick seam is and then the thin part of the fabric. And what I'm gonna do is start right there and just cut along that. Now, little known fact, actually it's probably not little known, a sleeve, a man's dress shirt sleeve is actually not perfectly symmetrical. So they're not gonna line up exactly. And in part 1, I talked about how you don't have to iron your shirt before you cut it, but when you do, it makes it where you can line your seams up better. This is one of those times, because if it was really badly wrinkled, I would have a heck of a time trying to get it to line up so that I can cut that all in one go. So what I've done, and I like that just because I don't want to have to cut all the way around and then, I don't know, it just seems like it saves steps to me. This is, again, the methodical part. As I've cut down, broken down, cut up, every other synonym for cut, these men's shirts, I've been thinking, gosh, that just seems like I'm duplicating my work. So I'm doing the same exact thing down the arm. I've rolled that in between my fingertips, and I'm trying to kind of, with that thumb, I'm pushing the fabric up just a little bit to keep it lined up as much as possible so that I don't waste a lot of fabric, because that is our goal, is to try to make as much usable fabric out of each of these parts. So that is actually still attached to the other sleeve, so I'm just gonna leave that piled up. And then now what we have is this sleeve. Let me open this up. Already I'm like, oh, there's so much fabric here. There is this little leg piece that I have tried to make that work and keep it intact. I've done strips of fabric like this, but what I have discovered is that's not really where the bulk of the fabric is. So I use that as scrap. I just cut that kind of clean across like this, and that goes in my scrap bin. And now I have this whole big swath. I like that word, swath. I think I say it a lot, actually, of fabric. And I want you to see how much fabric this is. So I have this is a fat, actually it's a fat quarter that I folded in half. So you could get a visual for how much that's a fat eighth, that right there, which is more fabric than you would think. If I lay this out, or actually let me put it down first. And then I put my green sleeve fabric on top of it. It is remarkably close to a fat eighth. Actually, if I cut this little part off, it would cover that amount, and it would be almost exactly a fat eighth. And then there's all this extra. So I'm gonna hold that up. You can kind of see. So there's this little part at the top, and then there's a little bitty part at the bottom, And yet there's all this over here. And that's one sleeve, one sleeve. All right, so in the interest of time and you not watching me do that whole process all over again, because it's the exact same process, cut the cuff off, start at the shoulder, cut that shoulder seam right down underneath the arm, and then that little section that with the buttonhole, I'm gonna do that again so that I have 2 fat eighths, which 2 times fat, fat eighth equals fat quarter. But I did want to just really briefly show you, sometimes a cuff will have really pretty fabric on the inside. So this was the cuff. Actually, this is the cuff. And it's a really pretty fabric to begin with. But then when I cut it open, I was like, oh, ooh, I love that. So if you have that and you want to save it, just like we did in the cuff link cuff, you can do that pretty easily. And what you do is you cut off the buttonholes to make a straight line. And then you cut off where the button would have been or any curved parts. And you do exactly what we did on our cuff link. Slide your seam ripper in, and you can either cut that top or seam rip that too. And what you end up with is that. And you may think, that's not a lot of fabric, and it's not, but it makes a really pretty scrap. So that is kind of the sleeve cuff combo. Lots of choices, depends on what kind of shirt you have. You may decide the cuffs aren't worth it and you chuck them, and I support that. And so that's where we are with this. Next up is the collar and the yoke, which is so exciting, which, I mean, it's probably not, but it is for me. I just really like it. This is the Catbird Quilts, and I'm Kathy Martin. And I hope you'll stay with me for the next video, and thanks for watching this one.